Sometimes you think, what if everything had gone just a little differently? What if on one day someone had simply turned onto a different path, or hadn't uttered a certain phrase, or even just stayed home? The history of humankind is full of such moments, instants when the world balanced on a knife's edge between one future and a completely different one. There is a concept in science called the butterfly effect. It was coined by a meteorologist named Edward Lorenz back in the 60s of the last century. He was working on weather forecasting and noticed an astonishing thing. If he changed the initial data in his calculations by only a tiny amount, by rounding off some number, then in 2 weeks, the weather in his model became entirely different. Lorenz called this phenomenon the butterfly effect, suggesting that the flap of a butterfly's wing somewhere in Iowa could ultimately lead to a hurricane in Indonesia. Mathematicians call such critical moments bifurcation points, a word derived from the Latin for forking or division. Imagine a fork in the road, where the path splits into 2 or even 3 directions. Up until this moment, everything proceeds along a beaten track. Everything is predictable and clear. But then suddenly, the system, be it a river, a human life, or an entire civilization, approaches such a fork, and the future path can radically differ depending on which branch fate chooses. History does not like to reveal its secrets easily. Philosophers have debated for centuries about what is more important, iron necessity or blind chance. The ancient Greeks embodied this debate in the images of 2 goddesses. Ananke personified inexorable necessity, and Tyche, blind chance. But life, as always, turned out to be more complicated than any theories. The necessary and the accidental are so tightly interwoven in history that sometimes it is impossible to tell where one ends and another begins. Let's take a simple example. Russia needed access to the sea. That was a historical necessity without which the country could not develop. But the fact that this access turned out to be specifically at the mouth of the Neva, where Peter built his Petersburg, and not in Reval or Riga, is already a matter of chance. Military circumstances unfolded that way. The cards fell that way. And now we have been living with this choice, which history once made for us, for 300 years. Today, I will tell you about 10 such moments, 10 points where the fate of humankind hung by a thread. These are not just interesting stories, although they are indeed gripping. These are moments when the slightest change, one storm, one bullet, one flap of that very butterfly's wing, changed everything. And the most amazing thing is that these events are not invented. Each one is documented, and each one truly happened. How did I choose these 10 accidents? According to 3 main criteria. First, the scale of consequences. The event had to change the course of history for millions of people, if not for all humankind. Second, the element of chance. In every story, there must be a moment when everything could have gone completely differently, and for a completely insignificant reason. And third, documented proof. No legends or myths, only verified facts. Ready to embark on this journey through the crossroads of history? Then settle in, and let's start from the very beginning, from the times when the greatest conqueror in human history set off on his last hunt. There, in the steppes of distant Asia, an event occurred that saved Europe from conquest, although no one at that moment even suspected it. Imagine the end of summer in the 13th century. The steppe breathes heat. Dust rises in columns over the roads, and somewhere far in the west and east, armies are moving, armies that seem numberless and limitless. The world was completely different then, but people remained people. They tired, they dreamed, they made plans, and they did not know that fate was already sharpening its knife somewhere around the corner of history. By that time, the Mongol Empire had spread so wide that it took months for a messenger to carry news from one end to the other. It was a machine honed to perfection. The discipline of the steppe peoples, the speed of the mounted detachments, the ability to appear where you are not expected, and disappear before the opponent can recover. And at the head of all this stood a man whose name became synonymous with power, Genghis Khan, the one who united the fragmented tribes and turned them into an avalanche sweeping away kingdoms. The era was cruel, but its own order prevailed within it. Nomads knew how to value loyalty and punish treason without unnecessary words. They lived by laws where the word of the leader was law, and an oath was sacred. In those years, the empire looked west with hungry curiosity. There lay the rich lands of Europe, divided by internecine strife, where knights fought each other, and kings could not even agree on who was the most important among them. But before moving further west, business in the east had to be finished. The Tangut kingdom, stubborn and proud, refused to submit, and this was a challenge that the great conqueror could not leave unanswered. The campaign began as usual. Swiftly and ruthlessly, the army moved toward the capital of the defiant, surrounding city after city, erasing resistance like the wind wipes away traces in the sand. The leader was already past 60, an honorable age even by our standards, and certainly so in those times. The body remembered all the campaigns, all the wounds, all the sleepless nights under the stars, when he had to think not only about tomorrow, but also about the fates of thousands of people following him. And then, in the midst of this last campaign, something went wrong. Stories vary. Some say that during a hunt his horse stumbled and the fall was severe, not the kind you shake off and keep going, but one that leaves something broken inside, something that gives no peace, day or night. Others whisper of treachery, that a princess from a defeated people struck the blow on the very night she was supposed to yield to the victor. There is also a more prosaic, but no less cruel version: illness. Chinese chronicles, which value accuracy, speak of a fever that began at the end of summer and persisted for several days in a row. Modern researchers, armed with medical knowledge and the patience of archaeologists, cautiously suggest, what if it was the plague, an ancient affliction that spared neither leaders nor common warriors? A Persian sage, who lived later and collected fragments of memory about those times, wrote that death came before the capital of the defiant fell. Chinese chroniclers, however, asserted the opposite, that the city had already begun to surrender when the great conqueror's heart stopped. Who is right? Perhaps that is no longer so important. What is more important is that at that moment, history swung like a pendulum and took a different path. He commanded his inner circle to keep silent about what had happened until the task was completed. This was the wisdom of a general who understood that news of the leader's death could demoralize the army and embolden the enemy, and that war is won not only with swords, but with faith in the one who leads you forward. So the army continued to move. The city fell. The kingdom was erased from the map, and only later, when everything had settled down, did people learn the truth. The place of his rest remained a mystery, and that mystery is kept to this day. Legend speaks of a sacred mountain where no trails lead, and that he himself bequeathed that the grave be hidden, fearing desecration. There is something profoundly human in this. Even the mightiest of conquerors desired peace after death, a silence where no one would disturb your sleep. And now let's stop for a minute and think. What changed? The empire did not collapse overnight. The heirs continued their father's work. Troops still moved along the planned routes. But when the one whose will bound different peoples and tribes together departs, something intangible changes. The tempo, the mood, the very music of the campaign. The arrow flies in the same direction, but the trajectory is already slightly different. Had he lived a few more years, who knows? Perhaps Mongol horses would have drunk from the western rivers, and European castles would have seen steppe riders beneath their walls. Europe was weak and fragmented. Kings did not trust each other. Knights loved tournaments more than actual war, and there was no one to oppose the steppe discipline with something equal in strength. But fate decided otherwise. Perhaps it was the fall from the horse, maybe illness, or maybe just the exhaustion of a body that had endured too many campaigns and battles. What exactly stopped the great conqueror is not so important. What is important is that he stopped, and in this cessation, another world was born, another history, another Europe, which gained time to gather strength and find its own path. Sometimes history turns over, not from the thunder of battles, but from the quiet sigh of a person who lay down to rest and could not get up again. And in that silence, in that pause, the beating of another heart can be heard, the heart of time, which follows its own course, asking neither czars nor generals. And ahead of us awaits another story. There are no steppe horses there, but sea waves, no swords, but wind, which sometimes knows how to be kinder to some and harsher to others. And then it becomes clear that fate speaks many languages, and each one is worthy of being heard. Remember how in the last chapter we talked about the steppe conqueror whose life ended at the most unexpected moment? Well, his work did not die with him. The empire continued to grow, like a tree whose roots had gone too deep into the earth to stop. And one of the brightest branches of this tree was his grandson, a man named Kublai, who decided that the steppe horses needed to learn how to swim. In the second half of the 13th century, the Mongol Empire reached such dimensions that it took months for a messenger to cross it from west to east. Kublai moved the capital to Beijing and adopted the Chinese dynastic name, Yuan, showing that the steppe power now spoke the language of ancient civilizations. Korea had already bowed its head, recognizing itself as a vassal, and China was slowly but surely submitting under the pressure of the nomads who had learned to take cities. And further east, beyond the narrow straits, lay islands about which astonishing things were told, that warriors of a special fortitude lived there, preferring death to dishonor, and they were ruled not by one man, but by an entire system where the emperor was a symbol, and the actual power was held by military rulers. Japan was then governed by people of the Hojo clan, the de facto masters of the Kamakura shogunate, and they were so confident in their strength that they did not always even heed the advice of the courtiers. Kublai sent envoys demanding submission, but the islanders replied with silence, which speaks louder than any words. For the steppe empire, this was an insult, for until then, all who received an ultimatum either surrendered or fell under the hooves of the Mongol horses. But here, the conquerors faced an unfamiliar task. They had to sail the sea, not ride across the steppe, and that was a completely different matter. In the year we shall call 1274, a massive armada approached the shores of Japan. Contemporaries speak of 900 ships and tens of thousands of warriors, Mongols, Chinese, and Koreans, mustered into one army by force of command. The fleet moved from the Korean shores, and the small islands of Tsushima and Iki were the first to stand in its way, their garrisons resisting desperately, knowing that no help would come. After a short but brutal massacre, the conquerors moved on and landed in Hakata Bay, where they were met by the samurai. This is where what the Mongols did not expect began. The island warriors did not fight like all the other peoples the steppesmen had met before. Every samurai was ready to die but not retreat, and in this stubbornness, something ancient could be heard, something that could not be bought with either gold or fear. The battle was fierce, and although the Mongols had a numerical advantage, the shore fighting did not allow them to deploy their usual tactics. And then, when both armies were already tired and blood-stained the sand, it came from the sea, the wind that changed everything. A typhoon struck suddenly, as only sea storms do, when the sky changes color in an hour and the waves become walls. The ships, built in haste by people who knew more about the steppes than the seas, could not withstand it. They were hurled against each other, broken in half, and sank indiscriminately. Warriors, sailors, and those who were merely seeking safety on deck. When the storm subsided, only a fraction remained of the Great Armada, and Kublai received a bitter lesson. The sea is not the steppe. You cannot conquer it with courage alone. The Japanese, looking at the broken masts and the bodies washed ashore, whispered one word: kamikaze, divine wind. The legend stated that the storm god Rei-Jin himself had sent the typhoon to protect the islands from foreigners. Whether this is true or not is no longer so important. What matters is that people believed it, and this belief became part of their strength. But Kublai would not have been the grandson of Genghis Khan if he had given up after the first failure. 7 years passed between that time and the next attempt, during which the Japanese managed to do something. Stone walls and earthen ramparts, palisades, and fortifications grew along Hakata Bay, so that the landing would not be a walk, but an ordeal. The samurai trained to attack anchored ships on small, fast boats, learning to fight on water as confidently as on land. When, in the year we shall call 1281, the fleet approached the Japanese shores again, it was even larger than the previous one. Historians say this was the largest naval armada in human history until the Allied landings in Normandy during the Second World War. Just imagine the scale. The Korean flotilla and the Chinese flotilla joined together to unleash their full might upon the islands. But the Japanese met them quite differently than the first time. The fortifications worked, the light boats harassed the heavy vessels, and the samurai fought with such fury that the Mongols had to retreat and wait for reinforcements while sitting on their ships. And waiting on the water is always a risk, especially when August, the time for typhoons, approaches. And the wind came again. This time the storm was even worse. For 2 days, the sky and the sea were one, and no one knew where up was and where down was. The flat-bottomed vessels, built for river navigation and not for ocean storms, were scattered into splinters. Japanese chronicles say that up to 3/4 of the entire fleet perished, a monstrous figure even by the standards of those cruel times. After this, Kublai no longer attempted to conquer the islands. The empire realized there were boundaries that should not be crossed, and the sea proved to be one such boundary. And for Japan, these 2 typhoons became something greater than mere luck. They became the foundation for the myth of divine protection, that the islands were under the special patronage of the heavens. This myth lived for centuries, warming hearts in difficult times and reminding people that sometimes even the mightiest force shatters against the invisible walls of fate. And although modern scientists debate the details, how many ships exactly sank, what role the Japanese themselves played in the defense, the essence remains unchanged. 2 times in a row, nature sided with the islanders. And ahead of us awaits another story, where fate will play a cruel trick again, but this time not with a storm or illness, but with a simple human error on the streets of a European city, where one wrong turn will launch a chain of events that will overturn the entire world. After the stories about the wind that saved the islands, it is time to talk about the wind that pushed sails into the unknown, where maps ended in a white spot, and imagination painted sometimes dragons, sometimes the edges of the world, beyond which ships simply fell into the abyss. The end of the 15th century. This was a time when Europe began to suffocate within its own borders, when spices cost more than gold, and the path to the east was controlled by those who could name any price. In that era, the Mediterranean Sea was no longer the center of the world. It became an arena where Christian kingdoms and the Ottoman Empire looked at each other with distrust and fear. The trade routes to the east, along which caravans of silk and spices had traveled for centuries, now passed through lands where Europeans were not always met kindly. And it was then that some minds began to think, what if they tried to bypass the problem? Not from east to west, but the other way around, across the ocean that seemed infinite. Among these dreamers was one Genoese man, a person stubborn to the point of recklessness and confident in his rightness, as only those who see the goal more clearly than the obstacles on the way to it can be. His name was Christopher Columbus, and he had an idea that he considered brilliant: to sail west to reach India from the other side. The logic seemed ironclad. The earth is round, so if you sail in one direction long enough, Sooner or later you will arrive where you started, only from the other side. However, Columbus's calculations were incorrect. He relied on ancient scholars and medieval maps that significantly underestimated the size of the planet. According to his calculations, the distance from Europe to Asia via the west was only a matter of a few weeks of sailing, quite tolerable for the ships of that time. In reality, if nothing else had been in the way, his crew would have died of hunger and thirst somewhere in the middle of the boundless ocean, never reaching the shores of China or India. But the error in calculation was only the beginning of a chain of chance occurrences. Columbus began offering his project to various monarchs, and everywhere he was rejected. The Portuguese king, who was then the chief maritime authority in Europe, looked at the calculations and dismissed them. His scholars understood that the numbers did not add up. The English court also showed no interest in the idea of the Italian dreamer. Even in Spain, Columbus was sent away several times. The royal treasury was occupied with other, more pressing and understandable matters. And here, fate played its hand. At the beginning of the year we shall call 1492, the Spanish Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella completed the Reconquista, the centuries-long war with the Moors for the Iberian Peninsula. Granada, the last stronghold of the Muslims on Spanish soil, fell, and suddenly the crown had free funds and a desire to consolidate the success with something grandiose. It was at this very moment that Columbus reappeared with his project, and this time, perhaps due to the euphoria of victory, or perhaps simply because the time had come, they said yes. On the 3rd of August of that same year, 3 small ships, the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Nina, with 90 sailors aboard, left the Spanish port of Palos. Imagine these vessels. By modern standards, they were tiny wooden shells that had to cross the ocean relying only on the wind, the stars, and the captain's stubbornness. The crew was motley, ranging from experienced sailors to those who had been simply recruited with promises of wealth and glory. From the Canary Islands, the ships turned west and headed into the unknown. Weeks followed weeks, supplies dwindled, and the crew began to grumble. What if this Genoese man really was leading them to the edge of the world? On the 7th of October, Columbus changed course, turning southwest, following flocks of birds which, he reasoned, must be flying towards land. And then, early in the morning on the 12th of October, the lookout sailor on the Pinta, named Rodrigo de Triana, shouted the word everyone had been waiting for: land. What the sailor saw was an island in the Bahamas archipelago, which Columbus named San Salvador, Holy Savior. Landing ashore, the admiral solemnly planted the banner of Castile and drew up a notarized document claiming possession of this land on behalf of the Spanish crown. And he called the local inhabitants, people with copper skin who watched the newcomers with curiosity and without fear, Indians, because he was absolutely convinced that he had reached the shores of India. Herein lies the most amazing part of this story. Columbus never understood what he had discovered until the end of his days. He made 3 more voyages across the ocean, explored Cuba, Haiti, the coasts of Central and South America, but stubbornly insisted that all of this was the fringes of Asia, just slightly different from what he expected. He was shown inconsistencies, that the climate was not right, the people were not right, the plants and animals were completely unknown, but he shook his head and said that these were simply some remote provinces of the great Eastern powers. The irony of fate is that the new continent was named not after him, but after another Italian, Amerigo Vespucci, who was the first to understand and write that this was not Asia, but a completely new world unknown to Europeans. But by then, the deed was done. Others followed Columbus's ships, conquistadors and colonists, missionaries and adventurers, and an era began that changed both sides of the ocean forever. Just think, if Columbus's calculations had been correct, if the Americas had not existed in his path, we would now be living in a completely different world. Who knows? Maybe Chinese navigators would eventually have crossed the Pacific Ocean from the other side and been the first to colonize the western coast. Or the Portuguese, persistently moving along Africa, would have rounded the continent and reached India by sea, which they, in fact, did several years later. But history would have gone differently then, and it is quite possible that English, Spanish, and Portuguese languages would not have become so widespread in the world. Columbus's error, in calculations, in stubbornness, in the unwillingness to admit the obvious, turned into the greatest geographical discovery in human history. Two vast continents, whose existence the old world had not suspected, suddenly appeared on the maps, and a new era began, the era of globalization, when the fates of peoples separated by oceans intertwined so closely that they could no longer be untangled. And ahead of us awaits another story. There will be shots and chance again, but no longer on the open sea, but in the narrow streets of a European city, where one wrong turn of a car will launch a chain of events that will drag the whole world into war. After we talked about the open seas and errors in calculations, let us move to a completely different place, to the cramped streets of an old European city, where the cobblestones remember so many stories that if they could talk, they would speak until morning. The beginning of the 20th century. This was a time when Europe seemed calm on the surface, but something worrisome was simmering beneath that tranquility, like water before boiling. The Balkans were then called the powder keg of Europe, and this was no exaggeration. Old empires were bursting at the seams, young nations wanted independence, and the great powers each pulled the blanket toward themselves, not particularly thinking about the consequences. The Austro-Hungarian Empire held under its crown many peoples who spoke different languages, prayed to different gods, and dreamed of different futures. The Slavs of the south, Serbs, Croats, Bosnians, looked at neighboring Serbia, which was independent, and wondered, why not us? In this tense atmosphere, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, decided to visit Sarajevo. The choice of date was exceptionally unfortunate, the 28th of June, the day when Serbs recalled their defeat on the field of Kosovo many centuries ago, a day of national mourning and pride simultaneously. To arrive there with imperial honors on such a day was tantamount to waving a red flag in front of a bull. But the Archduke was not a villain from a fairy tale. On the contrary, he planned reforms, wanted to give the Slavs more rights within the empire, to create something like a federation where all peoples would feel equal. The problem was that for the radicals of the youth organization Mlada Bosna, this was even worse than open oppression. After all, if the empire became fair and comfortable to live in, why fight for independence then? It was better to eliminate the reformer before he had time to make his empire more humane. A group of 6 young terrorists received weapons, pistols, grenades, and even poison capsules to commit suicide after the deed. They were positioned along the route the Archduke's motorcade was supposed to take on the morning of that ill-fated day. Imagine, an early summer morning, the sun is already starting to heat up. Crowds of people are in the streets. Some came to greet the important guest, others simply to watch the procession. Around 10 o'clock in the morning, the motorcade of 6 cars moved along the planned route. Franz Ferdinand rode in the second car, along with his wife Sophie and General Potiorek. The security was surprisingly weak. For some reason, detectives from Vienna were left at home, and local police could not handle the crowd control. The first attack came when high school student Nedeljko Chabrinovic threw a grenade at the Archduke's car. Franz Ferdinand saw the flying object and managed to deflect it with his hand or push it away. Versions vary. The grenade exploded behind, damaging the third car in the motorcade, wounding staff officers and several people in the crowd. Chabrinovic swallowed the poison, which was supposed to kill him instantly, but either the capsule was spoiled or they simply gave him something weaker. It only made him vomit. He jumped into the river, but the water was only knee-deep there, and the enraged crowd grabbed him, beat him, and handed him over to the police. The motorcade sped on, and the remaining conspirators positioned along the road could do nothing. Either the crowd blocked the view, or the cars sped past too quickly. A reception took place at the city hall where the Archduke, still agitated, exclaimed, "A bomb was thrown at me." But protocol demanded continuation, and after a brief consultation, it was decided to change the plans, to cancel the rest of the program and drive to visit the wounded in the hospital. This is where fate prepared its main surprise. The driver was not informed of the change in route, or he misunderstood the instructions. Versions vary again. Instead of driving straight along the embankment, he turned onto the narrow Franz Joseph Street, where they were supposed to drive according to the original plan. General Potierek shouted that it was the wrong way, and the driver stopped to turn around. And on that very street, in a small cafe, sat 19-year-old high school student Gavrilo Princip. After the failure of the assassination attempt, he decided everything was over and went inside for a bite to eat. According to one legend, he was eating a sandwich when fate gave him a second chance. The open-top car stopped literally a few steps from him, almost motionless, defenseless. Princip did not hesitate. He walked up to the car and fired his Browning twice. The first bullet hit Duchess Sophie in the abdomen. She died almost instantly. The second pierced the artery in the Archduke's neck. Franz Ferdinand lived for a few more minutes, managing to whisper something to his wife, unaware that she was already dead. The crowd seized the gunman, and only the arriving police saved him from immediate retribution. Attempts were made to poison Princip with that very capsule, but it also did not work. He was arrested, and the investigation began. But the most important thing was not this. What was more important was the chain reaction launched by those two shots on the narrow street of the Bosnian city. Austria-Hungary accused Serbia of involvement in the assassination. After all, the terrorists were Serbs, albeit subjects of the empire, and the weapons came from abroad. On the 23rd of July, Vienna presented Belgrade with an ultimatum, a list of demands so harsh that fulfilling all of them would mean the de facto loss of sovereignty. Serbia accepted almost all points except one, the one that would have given Austrian investigators full freedom of action on Serbian territory. This was enough. On the 28th of July, exactly 1 month after the shots in Sarajevo, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia rose to defend the Slavs and began mobilization. Germany demanded Russia stop, was refused, and declared war. France was Russia's ally and also entered the conflict. Germany invaded Belgium to bypass French fortifications, and this drew Britain into the war. In a few weeks, all of Europe went up in flames. The war, which everyone expected to be quick and victorious, turned into a 4-year meat grinder. Trenches, gas attacks, tanks, airplanes, humanity invented ever new ways to kill each other. When the guns finally fell silent in 1918th year, the world counted about 20 million dead and just as many mutilated in body or spirit. All this because of one wrong turn, because of a driver who did not receive or did not understand new instructions, because of a random stop in front of a cafe where a terrorist was finishing his sandwich and had already accepted failure. If the car had driven past, if Princip had left a minute earlier, if something had gone just slightly differently, millions of people would have lived out their lives. Empires would not have collapsed. The map of the world would not have been redrawn so dramatically. And next, a completely different story awaits us. There is no war or politics there, but a quiet laboratory where one forgetful scientist left a petri dish on the bench and went on vacation, unaware that chance would present humanity with the most important medicine in the history of medicine. After the shots that ignited the World War, let's move on to a story of a completely different kind, a quiet laboratory story, where the hero is not a general or a terrorist, but a scientist with a habit of not washing his glassware on time. The late 20s of the last century, this was a time when medicine already knew much, but still stood almost helplessly against infections, like a person before a locked door without a key. Imagine a world where a simple scratch could kill, where childbirth was a lottery with death, and pneumonia sounded like a death sentence. Surgeons performed the most complex operations, but patients died not from the scalpel, but from what came after, from blood poisoning, from gangrene, from invisible enemies called bacteria, which they did not yet know how to defeat. Antiseptics helped externally, but what to do when the infection was already inside the body, flowing through the veins with the blood? In London, at St. Mary's Hospital, worked a Scottish bacteriologist named Alexander Fleming, a man with a sharp mind and a remarkably sloppy approach to laboratory cleanliness. Colleagues chuckled at his workbench, where petri dishes piled up in heaps, where it was not always clear which experiment was finished and which was still ongoing. But there was its own logic in this creative mess. Fleming was not just cultivating filth. He was observing how bacteria behaved under the most diverse conditions, even those not prescribed by the textbook. Even earlier, in the year we shall call 1922nd, he had already made one discovery, also almost accidental. Fleming was suffering from a cold, and instead of blowing his nose into a handkerchief, he decided to smear mucus from his own nose onto a dish with bacteria. A few days later, he found that in the areas where the mucus was, the bacteria had died. Thus he discovered lysozyme, an enzyme contained in tears and other bodily fluids. True, it turned out that lysozyme only killed harmless bacteria and had no effect on the truly dangerous ones, but the idea itself deeply intrigued the scientist. In the summer of the year we shall call 1928, Fleming was working with Staphylococci, the very bacteria that cause abscesses, blood poisoning, and death after surgery. He grew several cultures in petri dishes, and then gathered up for vacation and simply left them on the bench, neither tidying nor properly closing them. In a normally neat laboratory, this would have been an unforgivable mistake, but for Fleming, it was just another workday. While the scientist was resting, an amazing chain of coincidences occurred in London. The laboratory on the floor below was studying mold. They collected samples from homes where people with asthma lived, checking whether it was responsible for the attacks. And so, the spores of one rare species of mold, Penicillium notatum, somehow subtly traveled up the stairs or through the ventilation and flew into Fleming's open laboratory window. What is astonishing, it was not just a rare species, but a particularly aggressive strain, one of the few capable of producing the necessary substance in sufficient quantities. And then the weather played its part. A cold snap occurred, which was ideal for the growth of the mold, and then it warmed up again, just in time for the bacteria. If the temperature had remained constant, nothing would have happened. But in such a capricious English climate, the mold managed to grow first, and when the bacteria later revived, they met a prepared defense. Returning from vacation on the 3rd of September, Fleming began clearing the clutter on his bench. In one of the dishes he saw something strange, a colony of mold, and around it, a clear zone where the Staphylococci had been destroyed. Other bacteria grew normally, but where the mold's influence reached, they were absent entirely. Another person might have simply thrown away the spoiled dish, but Fleming was alert. He had already seen something similar with lysozyme, and now his professional curiosity awakened with new vigor. On the 13th of September of the same year, at a meeting of the Medical Research Club, he gave a report on his finding, naming the substance penicillin, after the mold that produced it. But problems began here. Isolating pure penicillin turned out to be hellishly difficult. The substance was unstable, quickly degraded, there was little of it, and Fleming was not a chemist to understand all the subtleties. He tried applying penicillin externally, moistening wounds with it, and this worked. But for serious treatment, the antibiotic needed to be administered internally, and that required pure, concentrated doses. Fleming published an article in the year we shall call 1929th, but the world paid little attention to it. The scientist continued to grow his mold, shared samples with colleagues, hoping that someone could solve the chemical problem. But years passed, and no breakthrough occurred. He He even began to use penicillin merely as an aid in the laboratory, adding it to culture media to filter out one kind of bacteria and leave others for study. And then they appeared, the pathologist Howard Florey and the biochemist Ernst Chain from Oxford. Florey became interested in Fleming's work on lysozyme, and through that, he found the article about penicillin. Chain was a brilliant chemist, and together they tackled the task with the persistence that the discoverer lacked. By May of the year we shall call 1940th, they managed to accumulate enough pure penicillin for experiments on mice. The results were staggering. Infected mice that received no treatment died within a few hours. Those injected with penicillin survived every single one. The reserved Florey, seeing this, uttered a phrase that is priceless. It looks like a miracle. In the year we shall call 1941st, they conducted the first human trials, and again, success. But then the Second World War broke out, and penicillin turned from a scientific curiosity into a military necessity. Soldiers were dying not only from bullets, but also from gangrene, from infected wounds, and from pneumonia in the trenches. The Allies poured enormous resources into the mass production of the antibiotic, and by the year we shall call 1944th, there was enough of it for all the wounded. Paris newspapers wrote about Fleming. He did more for the defeat of fascism and the liberation of France than entire divisions. In the year we shall call 1945th, the trio, Fleming, Florey, and Chain, received the Nobel Prize. Fleming himself was modest and called his fame the myth of Fleming, acknowledging that without the chemists, penicillin would have remained a laboratory curiosity. But without his sloppiness, without his observational skills, without that vacation and the open window, nothing would have happened at all. Since then, medicine has changed forever. Infections ceased to be a death sentence, operations became safer, childbirth less deadly, simple tonsillitis no longer killed children. Millions, tens of millions of lives were saved thanks to that dirty petri dish and the mold spores that flew into the window of the London laboratory. And next awaits a story about how sometimes fate gives a second chance at the very last second. There will be a firing squad post, a sentence read aloud, and a drum roll that changes sound at the last moment, presenting the world with one of its greatest writers. After the laboratories and the mold, let us return to where fate plays with man cruelly and mercifully at the same time, to a parade ground covered with December snow, where the cold penetrates to the bone, and the drum roll sounds like the counting down of the last seconds of life. The middle of the 19th century in Russia, this was a time when thinking aloud could cost freedom, and reading forbidden books could cost life. In Petersburg in those years, young people, full of ideas and hopes, gathered on Fridays at the apartment of the official Mikhail Petrashevsky. They talked about what could not be openly discussed: freedom of the press, the liberation of the peasants, fair trials, utopian socialism, Western ideas, dreams of a better future. All this boiled in their minds, but remained words, conversations by the fireplace, discussions until morning. Among the regulars at these Friday meetings was a young writer, the author of the novel Poor Folk, which brought him his first fame, Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky. He had been attending since the winter of the year we shall call 1847th, listening, arguing, and sharing his thoughts about the injustice of the world. And in April of the year we shall call 1849th, at one of the meetings, he read aloud the letter from the critic Belinsky to the writer Gogol, a text that was audacious, accusatory, and banned by censorship. What the circle members did not know was that there was an informer among them. A student named Pyotr Antonelli regularly attended the meetings, nodded in agreement, incited bolder statements, and then wrote everything down and passed it to the third section, the secret police of the empire. The authorities were already nervous. A wave of revolutions in the year we shall call 1848 had swept across Europe, Thrones were shaking, kings were fleeing capitals, and in Petersburg, they feared that the contagion of free thinking would reach them too. On the night of the 23rd of April, while the city was still asleep, the gendarmes conducted simultaneous arrests. Dostoevsky woke up to a knock at the door, saw men in uniform, and understood that it was over. He was brought to the building at Fontanka, 16, where other detainees were already sitting, sleepy, bewildered, silent. There, next to Antonelli's name on the list, someone spotted the note, "Agent" in the uncovered case, and everything fell into place. Dostoevsky spent 8 months in the Alexeyevsky ravelin of the Peter and Paul fortress. Solitary confinement, a silence that weighed heavily on his mind, long hours alone with himself and fear. Only in July was correspondence with relatives and receiving books permitted, but before that was absolute isolation, when you didn't know what they would do with you or if you would live until tomorrow. The military court was held behind closed doors. On the 16th of November, the sentence was pronounced for failing to report the circulation of a criminal letter and for reading forbidden texts. The writer was stripped of all ranks and rights of estate and sentenced to death by firing squad. Out of 123 defendants, 21 were sentenced to death. But there was one detail the condemned did not know. Emperor Nicholas I had commuted the firing squad sentence to penal servitude, deciding only to announce it at the very last moment. Early in the morning on the 22nd of December, the condemned men were taken from the fortress to Semyonovsky Square. Frost, wind, gray sky, troops drawn up in a square, in the center, 3 posts. Dostoevsky would later write that they had about 20 minutes left to live, no more. Everyone except one was dressed in long white shirts, shrouds for the condemned. The sentence was read aloud. Words about death, about the firing squad, about life ending in a few minutes. Then a priest with a cross, last communion, the last chance to pray. The first trio, Petrushevsky, Mombelli, and Grigoriev, were tied to the posts, their eyes covered with white cloths. Grigoriev, whom solitary confinement had already undermined from within, completely lost his mind in those minutes. His psyche could not bear it. The soldiers raised their rifles. They aimed. Dostoevsky stood in the second trio, next in line, and watched all this, realizing that in a minute it would be his turn to stand at the post, feel the cold wood against his back, and wait for the thunder of the shots. He later confessed to his brother that he thought he had 5 minutes left to live, and these minutes seemed like an eternity, in which an entire life could be experienced. And just then, when the soldiers were already aiming, when the seconds flowed slowly like honey, the drum roll of retreat sounded. An officer appeared with a paper, a decree of pardon. The death penalty was commuted to penal servitude, for some 8 years, for others 4. The emperor graciously halved Dostoevsky's sentence, 4 years of penal servitude in Siberia, followed by service as a private. This entire staging was deliberately conceived, to frighten, to break, to show that power could grant life and take it away at its own discretion. Nicholas I wanted to teach the freethinkers a lesson, and that lesson was terrifying. But he could not foresee that this man in a white shirt at the post, who survived his own death and resurrection in a few minutes, would emerge from Siberia different, deeper, wiser, more religious. The penal servitude in Omsk was hell on earth, hard labor, shackles, the company of murderers and thieves, cold, diseases. But there, amidst this hell, Dostoevsky rediscovered the gospel for himself, the only book convicts were allowed to possess. He read it intensely, re-evaluated his life, his ideas, searching for answers to questions about good and evil, suffering and redemption. Returning many years later to Petersburg, no longer a young man but a mature writer with a baggage of experience, he would write what he would never have written if the shots on Semyonovsky Square had sounded for real. Crime and Punishment, with Raskolnikov's agonizing path to repentance, The Idiot, with Prince Mishkin, the embodiment of Christian goodness, Demons, about the danger of radical ideas, and finally, The Brothers Karamazov, a novel about faith, doubt, and the human soul, one of the greatest in world literature. All this might not have happened if the drum roll had been a minute late, if the emperor had decided to see the spectacle through to the end, if the bullets had flown from the rifles. The world would have lost one of its greatest writers, and Russian literature would have been poorer forever. But fate gave Dostoevsky a second chance, bought at the price of the horror experienced, and he used this gift in such a way that 1.5 centuries later, we are still reading his books and finding answers to eternal questions in them. And next awaits a story about how nature will intervene in human affairs again. There will be fog, a river, and an army that should have perished, but was saved thanks to the morning haze that concealed the retreat and granted a new country the chance of birth. After the frosty parade ground in Petersburg, let us transport ourselves across the ocean to where a new nation was just beginning to emerge, where a group of colonists decided they had had enough of paying taxes to a king who sat across the sea and had never been to their lands. The summer of the year we shall call 1776. This was a time when the ink on the Declaration of Independence had not yet dried, and war was already knocking at the doors of the young republic. George Washington understood that New York was the key to everything. Whoever controlled this city and its harbor would cut the colonies in two, isolating the North from the South, cutting off trade and communication. The British understood this too, and so, when they were driven out of Boston in the spring, everyone knew the next target was precisely here. Washington began concentrating his Continental Army near the city, fortifying positions and preparing for the inevitable. But the forces were unequal from the very beginning. The British Empire, it was a machine fine-tuned by centuries of wars, with a professional army, a navy that dominated the seas, and money to hire mercenaries from all over Europe. The Continental Army, these were farmers with rifles, militiamen who had been plowing the land yesterday and today were learning to march in formation. They had enthusiasm and faith in their just cause, but that was little against the volleys of regular troops. On the 22nd of August, the British General William Howe began transferring troops to Long Island, the island where Brooklyn is now located. 20,000 soldiers, including German Hessian mercenaries, landed ashore and began a slow, methodical advance toward the American positions. Washington had about 10,000 men, divided into two lines of defense, the first on the Gowanus Heights to the south, the second on the Brooklyn Heights closer to the river. On the 27th of August, the battle began that would become the largest in the entire War of Independence. The British acted smartly and coolly. The right flank under the command of Generals Clinton and Percy executed a night flanking maneuver, found a weak spot in the American defense at the Jamaica Pass, and struck from the rear. Simultaneously, German mercenaries attacked the center, and General Grant pressed the American right flank. The American defense collapsed like a house of cards. General Sullivan's division retreated in disorder toward the main forces. The center was crushed, and only on the right flank did something occur that would become legend. Lord Stirling's brigade found itself pinned against the swamps, surrounded by superior enemy forces. 400 soldiers from Maryland under his command launched a suicidal attack against 2,000 British regulars commanded by General Cornwallis. They attacked once, retreated, regrouped, and went again. The British general later said that Stirling fought like a wolf. More than 250 Marylanders fell in that hopeless fight, but they bought time for the rest of the brigade to retreat through the swamps to Brooklyn Heights. Washington, watching the battle, exclaimed, "My God, what brave fellows I must this day lose." By evening, the Americans were cornered at the last line, the fortifications on Brooklyn Heights. Behind them, the waters of the East River splashed. Ahead stood the British Army, ready to finish off the opponent. Howe could have attacked immediately, sweeping the fortifications in one blow, but he remembered the bloody slaughter at Bunker Hill, where the British took the position but lost 1,000 men. He decided not to rush, to begin a siege, dig trenches, and bring up artillery, to act according to the textbook. This slowness gave Washington a chance. On the 28th of August, while the British were digging trenches, the American general convened a council of war. The situation was desperate. 9,000 men trapped, the river behind them, the enemy ahead, and no possibility of a breakthrough. To stay meant waiting for the British to bring up cannons and smash the fortifications to splinters. But there was nowhere to retreat to either, except across the water. And Washington resolved upon a desperate move, a night evacuation across the river to Manhattan. It was a crazy idea, almost impossible to execute. They needed to transport 9,000 people, cannons, horses, supplies, all of this across a wide river with a strong current, in the dark, right under the noses of a 20,000-strong enemy army. If the British found out, if they started shelling the crossing, it would be a massacre, not a retreat. But luck, or providence, as the faithful would later say, was on the American side. Serving in Washington's army was a regiment from Massachusetts that included fishermen and sailors from the port of Marblehead, people who had spent their lives sailing and knew the water better than their own homes. They were mobilized for the crossing. They rowed back and forth in their longboats and boats all night, ferrying soldiers in batches. The night was dark. The wind was blowing the wrong way. Sailing ships could not help. The noise of the oars, the creaking of the oarlocks, the whispered commands, all of this could have betrayed the retreat at any second. Washington personally stood on the shore and supervised the loading, allowing no one to panic or rush. The infantry boarded the boats, the rowers disappeared into the darkness, and returned for the next batch. And then, just as dawn was breaking and the British were about to discover what was happening, a miracle occurred. A dense fog rose from the river, thick, white, impenetrable, so that a person could not be seen from 2 steps away. It enveloped the river, the banks, the boats, turning the whole world into a milky shroud, where sounds were muffled and outlines blurred. Under the cover of this white wall, the last American units, including the rear guard, quietly boarded the boats and sailed away. When the fog lifted and the British finally noticed the suspicious silence in the American camp, it was already too late. The fortifications stood empty, the campfires were still smoking, but the men had vanished like ghosts. The entire Continental Army, down to the last soldier, had crossed to Manhattan whole and unharmed. Howe was furious. His prey had slipped away literally from under his nose. This fog saved not just 9,000 lives, it saved the revolution itself. If Washington's army had been destroyed in Brooklyn, if the general had died or been captured, the rebellion would have been crushed in its infancy. Congress would have dissolved, the colonies would have returned under the British crown, and the world would never have known the United States of America. Instead, the war continued for 7 more years, with victories and defeats, with retreats and advances, until finally, in the year we shall call 1783, the English recognized the independence of the new nation, and it all began with that August fog on the East River, which arrived at the right moment and concealed the retreat, giving history yet one more chance to turn in a different direction. And ahead of us awaits the last story. There will be a ship and the sea again, but this time not fog, but the wind will decide the fate of an entire empire, and we will learn how nature knows how to side with someone, even when it seems that everything is already predetermined. After the August fog that saved the American rebels, let us travel back in time to the century when Europe was just beginning to divide the world among itself, when gold flowed like a river from America into the Spanish treasury, and Catholics and Protestants looked at each other with hatred ready to turn into war at any moment. The end of the 16th century, this was the era when Spain was considered invincible, and the sun itself, as they said, never set on its possessions. King Philip II sat in his gloomy El Escorial palace and looked at maps where half the world was colored in the hues of his empire. Spanish galleons carried silver from Peru and Mexico. Spanish soldiers kept the Netherlands in submission, and the Spanish Inquisition monitored the purity of the faith. But to the north, across the strait, existed a small heretical country that not only rejected the true faith, but also dared to aid the Dutch rebels and plunder Spanish ships with the blessing of its queen. England under Elizabeth I was a thorn in the side of the Spanish Empire. Her pirates, or captains as they were called at court, Francis Drake, John Hawkins, and others, like sea wolves, hunted Spanish galleons laden with gold. Drake even completed a circumnavigation, robbing Spanish settlements on the Pacific coast of America along the way, where the Spanish considered themselves completely safe. And in the year we shall call 1587th, Elizabeth executed her cousin, the Scottish Queen Mary Stuart, who was Catholic and a claimant to the English throne. For Philip, this was the last straw. The Pope declared the campaign against England a crusade, promising the remission of sins to all participants, and the Spanish king began assembling the greatest fleet the world had ever seen. The plan was grandiose. The Armada would pass through the English Channel, meet the 30,000-strong army of the Duke of Parma stationed in the Netherlands, take these soldiers aboard, and land in England. English Catholics, the king calculated, would revolt against the heretical queen, and everything would end quickly and triumphantly. By the spring of the year we shall call 1588th, a huge flotilla had gathered in Lisbon, 130 ships of various types, from powerful galleons to small transport vessels. More than 2,400 cannons, 19,000 soldiers, 8,000 sailors. It was a machine built for one purpose. The Spanish called it the Great and Most Glorious Armada, but a simpler name stuck among the people, the Invincible. But something went wrong from the very beginning. Spain's best admiral, Álvaro de Bazan, died just before the campaign, and command was given to the Duke of Medina Sidonia, an honest man, but completely inexperienced in naval affairs, who himself asked the king not to appoint him to the position. Drake carried out a daring raid on Cadiz in the previous year, burning many ships and supplies, delaying the Armada's departure for a whole year. And when the fleet finally left Lisbon on the 28th of May, a storm began that scattered the ships and forced them to return to port for repairs. Only on the 19th of July did the Armada finally appear off the coast of England, formidable, slow, arrayed in a crescent shape for defense. The English fleet was smaller in number, but its ships were lighter, faster, and better armed. The English had long-barreled cannons that shot further than the Spanish ones, and commanders accustomed to the freebooting pirate style of combat, where speed and maneuver were key, rather than lining up according to regulations. For a week, the two armadas sailed parallel courses through the English Channel, and the English attacked, retreated, and attacked again and again, like dogs biting a bear, not allowing it to turn around. The Spanish held their formation and fought back, but could not force a decisive battle upon the enemy. The English ships simply did not approach boarding distance, where the Spanish infantry could prove itself. On the 6th of August, Medina Sidonia brought the fleet to Calais, where he was supposed to meet the Duke of Parma's army. But here a fatal planning error was discovered. There was no deep-water harbor in those locations. Large ships could not approach the shore, and small barges carrying soldiers were blocked by Dutch rebels in their light vessels. The Armada dropped anchor, defenseless, waiting, not knowing what to do next. And then the English delivered a blow that would go down in textbooks. On the night of the 8th of August, they sent fire ships, old vessels packed with gunpowder, pitch, and everything that could burn, with set sails, into the midst of the Spanish fleet. Imagine darkness, silence, and suddenly, burning ghosts emerge from the gloom, heading straight for you, and you do not know whether they will explode or simply set your ship on fire. Panic gripped the Spanish. Captains cut their anchor cables to get away faster. Ships collided with each other. The formation broke apart. On the morning of the 9th of August, the English overtook the scattered Armada near Gravelines and staged a slaughter. 8 hours of continuous fighting, where English cannons shelled Spanish ships, preventing them from closing the distance. The Spanish lost several ships, many people were killed and wounded, and Medina Sidonia realized the operation had failed. Retreating the same way through the English Channel was impossible. The English fleet controlled the strait. There was only one path left, around the British Isles, through the cold waters of the north, past Scotland and Ireland, back to Spain. It was a desperate decision, but there was no other way out. And here nature spoke its word. Autumn storms in the North Atlantic do not forgive mistakes, and the Spanish ships were exhausted by fighting, overcrowded with wounded, their supplies of water and food dwindling daily. Hurricane winds, the English called them the Protestant wind, sent by God himself to protect the true faith, hurled the vessels onto rocks, sank them in whirlpools, and smashed them against the shores of Ireland and Scotland. More than 60 ships perished, only 7 of them in battle with the English. The rest were claimed by the sea. Thousands of sailors and soldiers drowned or were killed on the shore, where locals did not much care whether you were Catholic or Protestant if you had something valuable in your pockets. The ships that returned to Spain in the autumn were a pathetic sight. Broken masts, holes in their sides, exhausted people who had survived a nightmare and could barely believe they were alive. Philip II accepted the news of the catastrophe with outward calmness, but this was a blow from which Spanish naval power never recovered. Of course, Spain remained a great power. It still had colonies and gold, but the aura of invincibility dissipated like fog under the morning sun. And England, a small island country that survived thanks to better ships, brave captains, and a favorable wind, began its path to becoming the mistress of the seas. If the storms had not come, if the wind had blown in a different direction, if the Duke of Parma had been able to load his army onto the ships, who knows? Perhaps the Spanish infantry would have landed in England after all. Perhaps Elizabeth would have fled or perished, and the Protestant Reformation would have been drowned in blood. But history chose another path, and in that choice, the wind played a role no less significant than cannons and courage. And next awaits the last story, the most modern of all, featuring neither ancient wars nor royal fleets, but the Cold War of the 20th century, where one man in an underground bunker, looking at the blinking lights of computers, had to make a decision that could either save the world or destroy it in nuclear fire. After the Spanish galleons and the Protestant wind, let us move to a completely different era, to the times when humanity learned to create weapons capable of destroying the entire planet at once, and now sat on this powder keg, hoping no one would strike a match. The year we shall call 1983. This was the most dangerous time of the Cold War, when two superpowers looked at each other through the sights of nuclear missiles and waited to see who would blink first. Just 3 weeks before the events described, a Soviet fighter jet shot down a South Korean passenger Boeing with almost 300 people aboard. The plane violated the border, but the death of the civilians shocked the entire world. American President Ronald Reagan called the Soviet Union the evil empire, and in Moscow, they seriously feared that the West was preparing a preemptive strike under the guise of NATO exercises. Nerves were stretched to the breaking point, fingers rested on red buttons, and it seemed that just one spark was enough to start what no one would survive. 100 kilometers from Moscow, in the closed military town of Serpukhov 15, the command post for the new space-based early warning system, called OKO-I, was located. It was the pride of the Soviet defense industry, satellites in high elliptical orbits, tracking American missile bases, ready to detect a launch by the infrared radiation of operating engines. The system had been commissioned just a year ago, and, as it would turn out later, it still contained a mass of flaws that the creators had not had time to eliminate. On the night of the 26th of September, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Yevgrafovich Petrov was on duty at the command post, an engineer by training, an officer in the Missile Defense Forces, a man of 44 years who did not dream of glory and was simply doing his job. At 15 minutes past midnight, a siren wailed in the bunker, and the inscription "Missile Launch" lit up on the computer screens. The system reported that an intercontinental ballistic missile had been launched from the territory of North Dakota toward the USSR. Petrov later recalled that in those seconds, his brain turned into a computer processing a huge stream of information simultaneously. The protocol was perfectly clear. The duty officer must immediately report the launch to the superiors, and then the country's leadership would have 28 minutes to make a decision about a retaliatory strike. 28 minutes is the flight time of American missiles to Soviet territory, after which only radioactive ash would remain. But Petrov did not rush. A minute later, the system issued another signal, a second missile, then a third, a fourth, a fifth. A flashing red inscription, "Missile Attack," was on the screens. 80 soldiers and officers in the bunker watched the duty officer, awaiting orders. The phone line to the Kremlin was open and waiting for the report. But something kept troubling Petrov. Some internal feeling suggested something was wrong here. He began to analyze. First, all the launches came from one point, one military base in North Dakota. But Soviet intelligence knew the American nuclear doctrine. It provided for a massive first strike from all bases simultaneously, thousands of missiles that were supposed to wipe the USSR off the face of the earth in one go. Why would America launch only 5 missiles from one base? This did not look like the beginning of a war. Second, Petrov looked at the time and place. North Dakota at that moment was on the border of day and night. The sun was just setting below the horizon there. He recalled that in July of the same year, the system had already failed during testing, issuing a false alarm about a mass launch of missiles. Back then, due to a conflict between military and civilian developers, the problems were hushed up, but no one guaranteed they were completely fixed. Third, Petrov requested data from the long-range detection radars, the second echelon of the warning system. The visualizer soldiers, who tracked the sky on screens in dark rooms, reported they saw nothing. There were no missiles in the air. True, the radars were supposed to detect the missiles only a few minutes after launch, but every second without confirmation intensified the officers' doubts. Petrov made a decision that could either save the world or ruin his country. He picked up the phone and reported to command that the system was malfunctioning, that it was a false alarm. The risk was enormous. If he was wrong, if the missiles were indeed flying, the time for a retaliatory strike was decreasing, and every lost minute reduced the USSR's chances of retaliation. But his intuition did not fail him. The minutes dragged like hours. Everyone in the bunker froze in tense anticipation, while the red alarm lights continued to blink on the screens. Finally, confirmation came from the radars. The air was clear. No American missiles were detected. Petrov was right. The OCO system had erred. The subsequent investigation established the cause of the failure, and it was almost ridiculous in its banality. The satellites detected the reflection of sunlight off high-altitude clouds over the territory of the United States, from ice crystals in the atmosphere. A rare coincidence of the satellite's orbit, the angle of incidence of the sun's rays, and cloud cover created a picture that the imperfect program mistook for the infrared radiation of launching missiles. Essentially, the fate of the world hung by a thread because of a sun glare caught by a sensor in orbit. Petrov was not rewarded, not promoted, not made a hero. On the contrary, he was reprimanded for incorrect maintenance of documentation that night, given a reprimand, and a few months later, he retired with the same rank of lieutenant colonel. For long years, he kept silent. Military secret, the political sensitivity of the issue, unwillingness to admit system errors. He lived quietly in Fragility near Moscow, worked at a scientific institute, and few people knew that this modest man had once saved the world from nuclear war. Only decades later did the story become public. Petrov was invited to the UN. He was presented with several international awards. A documentary film was made about him. But he himself did not consider himself a hero. He said that he was simply doing his job, analyzing the data, and making a decision based on logic and common sense. Just think, if the duty officer that night had been a different person, less inclined to analyze and more inclined to follow instructions. If the officer had simply followed the protocol and reported the missile launch, then the Kremlin would have received information about an American attack, and the USSR leadership would have had 20-something minutes to decide to respond or not. And the answer in that situation would have been only one: to launch everything they had, because there would be nothing left to lose. And then, within an hour, thousands of nuclear warheads would have rained down on cities on both sides of the ocean. Moscow, Leningrad, New York, Washington, London, Paris, all would have turned into radioactive wastelands. Nuclear winter would have covered the planet. Harvests would have perished. Billions of people would have died from hunger, cold, and radiation. Civilization, as we know it, would have ceased to exist, all because of a sun glare and an imperfect computer program. Stanislav Petrov died in the year we shall call 2017, at the age of 77, quietly and almost forgotten in his homeland. But every year on the 26th of September, people who know this story remember him and how one man, acting against instructions and relying on intuition, gave humanity a future that otherwise might never have arrived. So we have gone through 10 stories, each of which is like a thin thread upon which the fate of millions, and sometimes all of humanity, hung. From the steppe expanses of the 13th century to the underground bunker of the 20th, from sea storms to laboratory petri dishes, everywhere we saw the same thing. History does not flow like a river in a predetermined channel. It is more like a traveler at a fork in the road, where the choice of path depends on a trifle that is easy to overlook. Philosophers have argued for centuries about what is more important: iron necessity or blind chance. Determinists claimed that everything is predetermined, that every event is the inevitable consequence of previous causes, and that history simply had no other way. The French philosopher Paul-Henri Holbach wrote in the 18th century, "Nothing in nature can happen by chance. Everything follows specific laws." From this point of view, the fall from a horse, the fog over the river, or the mold in the petri dish are not accidents, but inevitable links in the chain of causes and effects. But should we believe in such rigid predestination? When we look at the specific stories that passed before us, it is clear that at every critical point, an alternative existed. The Archduke's driver could have heard the new instructions and not turned onto that street. Washington could have tried to break through the British lines instead of crossing the river. Petrov could have simply followed the protocol and reported the missile attack. In every case, a choice existed, and the path history would take next depended on it. The Italian thinker Niccolò Machiavelli found a golden mean in this dispute, writing, "I judge that fortune manages half of our actions, but leaves us to govern the other half." There are currents that are difficult to resist: economic crises, demographic shifts, technological progress. But there are also moments when one person or one event can tip the scales one way or the other. The great man theory, developed by the Scottish philosopher Thomas Carlyle, asserted that history is made by outstanding personalities, heroes, geniuses, prophets. But our stories show something more complex. Yes, Washington was a great general, but without the fog on the East River, his greatness would have ended in British captivity. Fleming was a talented scientist, but without the accidental arrival of mold spores through the open window, penicillin would have remained nature's undisclosed secret. Stanislav Petrov was not a great man in the classical sense. He was an ordinary engineer who simply did not succumb to panic at the right moment. Perhaps it is more accurate to speak not of great men, but of great moments, when circumstances align in such a way that the decision of one person acquires cosmic significance. Petrov was not seeking heroism. He ended up on duty that night almost by chance. Princip did not plan to cause a world war. He was simply eating a sandwich when fate gave him a second chance. History is created not only by heroes but by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. And if we look at today, the crossroads where fate can turn have not diminished. Climate change, artificial intelligence, biotechnologies, nuclear weapons, all these are points of instability where one wrong decision can change the future in unpredictable ways. The Russian thinker Alexander Herzen wrote, "History is not a laboratory. There is no repetition of experiments. Every moment is new. Every event is unique." And this means that we cannot predict where and when the next critical junction will arise. The German philosopher Hegel noted that great events sometimes repeat themselves twice, as if history wants to make sure we have understood the lesson. But even this does not make the future predictable. We can learn from the mistakes of the past, but new challenges always come in an unexpected form. Who in the 18th century could have foreseen that nuclear weapons would put humanity on the brink of self-destruction? Who in the 19th century imagined that a computer error would almost trigger an apocalypse? The 10 stories we went through together teach one important lesson: to value the fragility of the world we live in. Peace and stability are not given once and for all. They are not guaranteed by the laws of nature. They are maintained by human efforts, sometimes conscious, sometimes accidental, but always important. When Petrov decided not to report the missile attack, he was not thinking about world history. He was simply following his intuition and professional experience. But this choice saved billions of lives. Personal choice at critical moments turns out to be more important than any theories about inevitability or predetermination. After all, history is made not by abstract forces, but by specific people who make specific decisions in specific circumstances. And these decisions do not always come after long deliberation. Sometimes you have seconds to choose, and everything depends on that choice. It is also worth remembering that chance does not always favor good. Sometimes a wrong turn starts a world war, or the survival of one person leads to tragedy for millions. History does not divide accidents into good and bad. It simply goes its own way. And only afterward, looking back, do we try to understand what led to what. If there is any wisdom to be drawn from all these stories, it is simple yet profound. The future is not written in advance. We have no guarantee that tomorrow will be better or worse than today. But we have a choice, and that choice is important, even if we do not realize its magnitude at the moment of decision. Perhaps this is the most important lesson of history, not to predict the future or search for patterns in the past, but to understand our responsibility here and now. Each of us, on our own scale, stands at certain crossroads, making decisions that affect other people. And no one can know in advance which of these decisions will turn out to be the one that changes everything. History continues, and we are all participants in it, not merely spectators. We live in a moment that will one day become the past, about which books will be written and films will be made. And who knows, perhaps somewhere right now, another chance event is occurring that will, decades from now, enter textbooks as a turning point in human civilization. Cherish this world, so fragile and so precious. Remember the fogs that saved armies, the winds that sank fleets, the mold that healed wounds, and the people who, at a critical moment, chose life instead of death. And live as if the future depends on your choice, because one day that might turn out to be true.